behalf of the National Museum of African Art, I want to welcome you all to tonight's Global Africa Talk with Kehinde Wiley and Victor Ekpuk. I first want to thank the director of the National Museum of African Art, Janetta Betch-Cole, for her hearty support of this series that invites international artists to consider their work's relationship to Africa. Kehinde Wiley is truly one of the great portrait artists of our time, and his personal history, career trajectory, and experiences in Lagos, Dakar, and elsewhere reveals a central role that urban Africa plays in contemporary art today. To further think through these connections, he will enter into conversation with renowned DC-based Nigerian artist Victor Ekpuk, and following his talk, and then we'd like to turn to you, the audience. Kehinde Wiley received his BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1999, then went on in 2001 to an MFA at Yale University. His multinational project has been exhibited around the United States. This project, of course, known as the World Stage. It's been seen at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Milwaukee, at the Art Space in San Antonio, at Robertson Tilton in Culver City, also the Rona Hoffman Gallery in Chicago, and elsewhere. He has an upcoming exhibit called 30 Americans, the Rubel Family Collection at the Corcoran Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C. In 2010, he was part of the Individual to Icon, Portraits of the Famous and Almost Famous, from folk art to Facebook at the Plains Art Museum in Fargo. In 2009, he was part of the Reconfiguring the Body in American Art show, 1820 to 2009, at the National Academy Museum. And so many of us here in this audience remember his 2008 show, Recognize, Hip Hop and Contemporary Portraiture, here at the Smithsonian, sponsored by the National Portrait Gallery. And curator Brandon is here tonight, so welcome to you. Special projects are many, and we'll hear more about those tonight, but I just did want to mention, of course, his 2010 project, the Puma World Cup project, in which he was commissioned to make portraits of 3 of football's kind of most decorated players. His 2006 Nike Billboard project that some of us saw in LA, and then from 2005, his VH1 Hip Hop Honors Awards, in which he was commissioned to paint portraits of all of the 2005 Art of Hip Hop honorees. In 2010, he also won the USA Network Character Approved Award. His work ranges in public collections around the world, but notably at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Miami Art Museum, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Hammer Museum, the Studio Museum of Harlem, of course, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Harn Museum of Art in Gainesville, and many more. So please join me in welcoming Kehinde Wiley to the stage.
Wow, this is always incredibly nerve-wracking for me, so bear with me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming. Tonight, I'd like to really sort of delve in directly into not only what it is that I'm up to right now, but I don't know, about how I got to where I am and what I hope to be doing beyond that. Let's see, we can start by talking about my interest in the portrait. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles back in the 70s, late 70s, mind you. Growing up in the late 70s and in the 80s in LA, it was a really sort of minefield. Gang warfare was the topic of the day, and it was something that wasn't to be thought about. It was something to be lived. Every day I remember being bused from the inner city of South Central Los Angeles to the more affluent suburbs to go to junior high school, and then of course later on I went to the High School for the Arts in Los Angeles. But one thing that I did notice growing up in Los Angeles when I began taking art classes was that there was an extraordinary collection of art there. And you don't think about Los Angeles as being the hub of great portraiture, but they have a great collection of 18th and 19th century French and English portraiture. And I'm thinking about some of the portraits at the Huntington Library and Gardens, for example, where as a young kid studying art, my mom was incredibly resourceful. I mean, we were not exactly the richest people in the world, but she found some programs that allowed for me to study art and to see examples of European portraiture that were profoundly different from anything that I had seen theretofore. Who were these people in powdered wigs and pearls and lapdogs and so on? It was really sort of alienating in many ways, but also absolutely fascinating. There was this falseness to it. There was this sense of purpose, this composing oneself into this discrete, unique presence that was at the service of the sitter, was at the service of a great propaganda act for an individual. And I think that, it's pretty cool. When I was graduating from Yale University and went to become the artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, I was walking down the street one day and I ran into this piece of paper that had this young man's face on it. It was a mugshot photo. And number one, I didn't know they made them in color these days. And number two, that they would have it printed out and that it would be sort of blowing in. I didn't know that his actual name would be showing up. That's got to be changed at some point. But the idea, though, is that looking at that image does make you think about portraiture in a radically different way. You know, you sort of counterpose that moment of what could ostensibly be called a type of portraiture. We're capturing an image of an individual, whereas in the works that I had seen as a child, choice was fairly evident. Here, you're reduced to full frontal, or classically frontal side. It's portraiture on a level of control, and then there's a certain sadness that surrounds that. And I think that this painting represents the first step that I had taken to proceed from that first moment of discovery within portraiture. I want to back up, though, and talk about what I was doing before that moment. Back at Yale, I was doing a number of portraits that sort of concentrated on these impossibly large afros. So much of Black American identity has to do, well, I would even trace it back to Black Africa. There's an identity that's situated and surrounded by and complemented by the ways that self-decor and hair pictures. And hair, in a biblical sense, always takes on a very sort of psychosexual, eroticized power dynamic. In a Smithsonian sensibility, one thinks about the hair as something that it once exists but can be cut down. Here, the hair decides to start playing with itself. This was something I started to do at the same time that I was thinking about the way that color functions in society. And color was something that I really enjoyed studying in the San Francisco Art Institute and going into artists such as Joseph Albers and reading the works of cultural critics who talked about color and the way that color functioned. Well, for example, why is it that when we go to most fast food restaurants, we always associate that with the colors red, orange, and yellow? You think of every fast food restaurant, you know. There is a social aspect to color, and social psychologists will use these as features of our thinking in order to trigger certain responses, consumer responses, and so on. Later, such as in this picture, I start using art historical quotation, this coming, of course, from Frida Kahlo's Blood Sisters, this sort of tying two figures one to the other, but in this time, sort of a type of twinning, doubling. Something about my own history, I'm a twin. Kehinde means second born of twins in Yoruba. I'm not ethnically Yoruba. My mother's a a scholar of African linguistics, and named me and my twin brother after the Ibeji, a very prominent name type in Nigeria. This twinning is something that you see in a lot of art history. You see it in Frida Kahlo's work, certainly. And I thought it would be interesting to pair not only my story and her story, but also the story of a late 17th century French Rococo artist, Fragonard, where he used these sort of sickening, sweet, sticky, candy cotton colors. I thought it was a really interesting way of juxtaposing the black male body up against. Very early on in that work, I was thinking about the ways in which we code for the black male body in public space. My education had been so much informed by simply walking this world and knowing that visceral response from the people who both loved me and the people who surrounded me but were curious by my kinky hair and my way of being. But at the same time, I was also very sort of protected from a lot of the history of, the fullness of the history. And I think what happens is these oversized and grand gestures that exist in the work. This piece, for example, is exactly this size. It's about this height and length. Starts to look into not only how race figures into the consumption of the male image in popular culture, but also the ways in which color starts to play into that. This painting, of course, was created during, I think it was 1999. At Yale, I was absolutely obsessed with Martha Stewart's 1999 home collection. She did this series of plates and towels with this sort of sickening seafoam green that was very tasteful. So the question is, how do these ways in which color exists in society impact themselves upon the black body? How do we find ways of creating new fields of provenance for the known? And so that's what that body of work was. Years later, of course, I began a different type of conversation, one which was much more art historically rooted, one which used the sloped tops of paintings as being like altar pieces within a chapel. There was this type of radiant light that sort of nodded towards a lot of the Venetian school of painting, specifically Tiepolo, and the ceiling frescoes that were part of so many of the works that I'd seen in the Academia collection in Venice. I went so far as to actually create my own ceiling fresco and to have all of those works combined together, and that was my first major public exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. And it was an opportunity to really begin a conversation about masculinity, the way that we've evolved a conversation about people who look like me, young black men who walk the streets of America, but who are by and large being seen but not known, being consumed in popular culture, but not fully, this type of caricature that I had seen in the global conversation increasingly was something that just felt sort of outsized and super real, something that was almost alluring in many ways. I mean, you look at an early 90s Hype Williams hip-hop video and look at those supercharged colors. You know, this is something that I consider to be very attractive, and the sense of light and so on was something that I understood as a visual practitioner. But I wanted to sort of poke my finger into this wound and see how deep it went. I wanted to see features of masculinity, for example, laid bare. Why is it that by and large, when thinking about African American presence in public space, we think so much about hypersexuality, antisocial behavior, a propensity towards sports? All of these features are part of the classic narrative. And I think as an artist, we can't turn away from these things. I think that as an artist, we should run directly towards them, into that flame, as though it were something that would be another palette color on the palette that can be investigated and used towards good measure. This painting, for example, uses a late French Rococo ceiling rosette, but all of the decoration behind the model is actually composed of individual sperm cells that are engaged in this synchronized swimming act. You can actually see certain little renegade sperm on the side. And the construction of heroicism and the pomp and circumstance that surrounds Western European easel painting is something that doesn't start here. It started somewhere else, clearly. And what I'm trying to do is to get to the heart and the soul of the matter, which is to get to the point where we start to look not at the features of skin or ethnicity specifically, but rather at the features of the male ego, the features of national border, the features of empire. And you can't help but to arrive at warfare once you get to that place. And in particular, one of the more sexy money shots, as you might have call it, is the equestrian military portrait. A side saddle might turn it on its side, and I think that's fair from time to time. This body of work was called Rumors of War. Rumors of War was created during the Second Gulf War, and it was my response to what I thought was an increasingly irresponsible use of force and power, and it was sort of in advance of what we now know, sort of new conversation around soft power. But we've got so many pictures historically that glorify and glamorize the wielding of power and the fashioning of it. One thing that you'll notice, though, in looking at these paintings is that the man on the horse seems to be in absolute control, and I think that's a feature of the original paintings. I actually went so far as to hire out Hollywood horses because real horses like flinch at flashbulbs going off, and I paint from photography. And guys sitting on horses don't look that powerful on a bucking horse. In fact, if you look at the stuff that I shot before, the man-to-horse ratio is actually a lot smaller, and it just doesn't look like that. And so we had to actually go into Photoshop and expand the size of my guy relative to the horse to give you that same sense of authority that existed in the earlier pieces. But that just goes into saying that painting has always been about smoke and mirrors. It's always been about this fabulous provocation, this construction of conspicuously fraudulent personae. And what's wrong with that in some ways? Well, what's wrong with it is that it can be at the service of ill from time to time and be a very provocative and terse way of pushing people over a hill. But at the same time, it can be a grand celebration of things that are to be celebrated. Or at other times, just simply ridiculous. There is, at the heart of this, though, an abiding love for the material act of taking colored paste and a hairy stick, and by the will and tact of one's being, pull together a tableau that actually looks like something. That's something I always remind myself of when looking at these paintings, that they are very sort of basic objects that exist in the world. They take on material and physical form, and part of that narrative around physicality I think, is also a narrative around scale. And there's a reason why when you go to the Louvre and you look at the great paintings of David, for example, or Rubens, you begin to see that scale matters. This projection screen will give you only a minute sense of how grand the chest beating goes on within the history of Western easel painting. And I think there's something in there. I think there's something about scale that in our own American way we can see repeated in the post-war iterations of abstraction. You think about the great paintings of Motherwell and Warhol and that sense of very macho male painting of the 50s and 60s. This is something that has to do with not only dominating the canvas, but dominating the viewer. It has to do with not only creating a painting that is not, a painting that disappears from image making, which is what abstraction was, the slaying of the image. But it was also the slaying of any sort of sense in which sympathy becomes an act in which the artist takes part. The artist in those works simply functions at the service of the painting. It's this obelisk, this erect object standing in the field. And I think that there's something to be investigated there. This is a painting that was part of a group of paintings called Columbus. In this body of work, I went to Columbus, Ohio, and responded to the museum's permanent collection, this being one example of the works that was in the permanent collection. I actually went to the streets and found models from the community to take on the poses of the works. The idea here is that, as many of you may know, all of my models are sourced from predominantly black and brown neighborhoods of large and small, medium-sized cities throughout America and increasingly globally. And in investigating the museum space as a site of exclusion and as a site of culture and as a site of possibility, the works were using people from the community and allowing them to participate in the construction of who they are. I say that to say that all of them were looking at printouts, color printouts of the paintings, and they were choosing who they wanted to become. There was, for example, this painting, which relied quite heavily upon this. Where I came in was to imbibe this painting with a sense of light, a type of glowing that's more akin to a religious light, a type of rapturous light that we would see in a more Venetian-style ceiling fresco. Columbus also was an opportunity to start talking about the context of the museum, the authority of the museum, the ways that types of frocked wallpaper, the ways in which gilded framing, the ways in which the hushed carpeting of the salon are things that inform a painting, inform the context in which the artist and the audience participate in a grand narrative that we call the museum space, the salon space. And so in this particular exhibition, it was important that this room, which originally was 4 naked white walls and clean concrete floors, was transformed into this sort of warm, smoky, old school viewing environment. Additionally, what you might notice in these works is that body language is super important. What might pass for a very seemingly appropriate Western painting, in other contexts, people ask me, is he throwing gang signs? And it's not a provocation. It was specifically paintings like this, in which that question came up. Body language is something that is contextually driven, and it goes from something as simple as throwing signs to something as as known as to what a sort of powerful male pose is in a painting. So much of what we do is to create a sense of bravado because the sitter wants to be seen as a powerful person. Poses like these don't necessarily communicate that. Poses like these, oftentimes, to many of my models, are a little bit hard to pull off, whereas in the historical context, it was something that was the absolute site of power. It was the absolute site of cultural domination in Dutch paintings and so on. And so it's interesting to see the ways in which transcribing black bodies from one context to another, we start to see the contours of a very different relationship with the human body. Religious iconography, though, is something that we see throughout all of art history. As you know, the patrons of art historically have been the church and the state. And so many of the works, this body of work in particular, rely upon a lot of religious iconography. A note about the decorative. As you may notice, many of my models are sitting in these fields of decorative flowers, of decorative, ornate, patterned backgrounds. What I try to do is try to create decorative features that mimic and echo the period of time that the quotation is coming from. If it were late French Rococo, if it were Baroque, it would be in keeping with that time period. There was a question for me about the field and the sitter, the sense of the portrait and the landscape. Art historically, there's always been this divide between the powerful human presence, usually male presence, usually white male presence, and the landscape, which is comprised of not only the ground, but the home and the cattle, and usually in equal measure, the wife and kids. Those power dynamics are things that I try to sort of investigate and not necessarily fix in this work, because I don't think at all that I'm providing any solutions, but rather scratch the ground of, provoke, flatten. As you may see in my work, there's at once a flat field and a three-dimensional field. There's the foreground and there's the background, but they're sort of fighting for dominance within the picture. And I think that's an important point to make within painting. This is a little different. This body of work was inspired by the propaganda posters of the People's Republic of China during the Cultural Revolution. Much of that work was using decorative patterns that came from Chinese textiles and using poses that came from a completely different cultural background. I began traveling as an artist. At this point, I was all over the place, visiting different shores and having exhibitions and thinking about different cultures and different societies, and noticing that a lot of what I had thought was a very Black American sense of composure, dress, music, some people might call it hip-hop, was now increasingly global. And those echoes were something that I thought would be interesting to sort of get down in some way without exactly knowing where I was going. It's tough, though, to sort of uproot. I began actually by street casting in Brooklyn and finding models who came from that narrative that I began in, this sort of very Black American narrative of the Fulton Mall in Brooklyn meets the propaganda posters of China. Very strange body of work. I'm not entirely sure how they dance together, how these signs work together. But I think the job of the artist is to sort of proceed forward and to scratch areas of curiosity. while making those works, I noticed that a lot of the propaganda posters had these sort of incredibly large smiles. That has to do with the original propaganda posters. They were designed to communicate to the Chinese people at that time that their futures would be bright and that they should be working towards a bright future. It was hard to convince my models to take on those smiles. I think a lot of what the models expected was to come into the studio and to be wielding swords and riding horses and to sort of, being sort of an active participant in this conversation around Western European male power and agency. And what happens when you start to change the conversation? This is about power, but it's about state power, and it's about negotiating the minds of an entire body of people, billions strong, using very specific moments in history. At this point in China's history, you would find these posters in the homes of every villager, replete with little red books that give you the rules on how to think and how to act in that society. There are moments, though, where I start to inject aspects of where I came from before, little echoes, things such as the book in their hand, which nods to Ang. The red book from Mao, of course, being the starting place from all of that. Within that project, though, working with these models on this act of smiling, this act of absolute artifice, this sort of, I get that feeling after cocktail parties sometimes. It's just like, what I did was I actually invited all of the models who participated in the project to come back to the studio and to participate in a second body of work that looked at this smile specifically. And so what I did was I actually had them sit and smile for me. And I had a video camera running. And while I'm a painter, I also work in other media, sculpture, and so on. I created a video project in which they smiled for exactly 1 hour. And the smile became its own personal prison. And it sort of, can we cue that? You'll see that the smile actually is different for everyone in the piece. I don't know, I can't tell if that's playing or not. Now it's playing. An hour. So it starts here, and it starts very sort of nice, and then it decays into muscle spasms. And for the dignity of my models, we've left that part out. But it's certainly something. I think that's good. So that's where that comes from, and that's where how we arrive at that moment. Other moments where we're talking about the backgrounds, we have to sort of go into the decorative, which I mentioned a bit. I'm trying to speed up a bit because I think I'm at a loss for time. Porcelain vases, textiles, the decorative, all of that informs the work, and all of that takes it into a new field that I'm destabilized at this point. I don't know quite what this conversation is introducing. I don't know quite what it means to be a young black American sort of trying to work out some of these global questions of identity, power, nationhood. I'm talking about already something very abstract, something very powerful, which is Western European empire. And now I'm working a field and visiting different nations and working within their vocabularies of empire and power and control and domination. And what does that mean towards any sort of liberation ideology? Do you even think about liberation when you think about your paintings anyway, Kehinde? Fuck liberation. You should just go ahead and self-service yourself when you're thinking about it. All of these thoughts are going through my mind as an artist, because in the end, what you want to do is to try to proceed in a way that makes something that matters, something that turns me, the viewer, on, rather than me, the thinker, on. There's nothing worse to me than purely intellectual masturbation when it comes to painting. I think that there should be, at its heart, a type of painting that engages what actually occurs on the street. But also, there's a certain expectation of young black American artists that they're going to be providing a type of fist-pumping political corrective that's almost knee-jerk, and I think that's radically uninteresting as well. I think that that freedom to make these type of experiments, whether they are successful or not, is the calling card. I went on to Africa with the same idea, and it wasn't much of a stretch here because my father's from Nigeria, and I'd spent many years going back and forth to Africa and trying to come to terms with my own personal story and him. But I noticed that there were these public sculptures everywhere, and they were monuments towards former military generals. They were monuments towards former colonial masters. They were also objects that talked about national unity and ethnic unity, but they were all oftentimes in cement. They were oftentimes located in areas that were not necessarily city centers as we might notice them in the West. It's an entire phenomenon of art history that hasn't been fully documented. If there are any art historians here, I challenge you to uproot and look at West Africa in that regard. And the sculptures are in decay. They're things that fall victim to the elements. All of the models here again are street casts from Lagos, Nigeria, and from Dakar, Senegal, recreating some of those public objects and simply attempting to arrive at something that is both part of that very American vocabulary that I began before, but also part of a very neo-global engagement. But again, another point about place, you know, an amazing sculpture such as this sculpture, which is nameless and authorless, in the middle of, I believe this was, it was just outside of Oshodi, I think. Another sort of amazing piece that we should realistically have a literature surrounding these works. Moving on into Senegal, I wanted to sort of engage both public works as well as traditional works, and sort of how we see what we might call primitive art objects from Africa in quotations, and how those can be transcribed upon the bodies of young black Africans. What's interesting though about this is that when I'm in New York street casting and when I'm in Senegal or Nigeria street casting, it's totally different. You get a very different response from people. In New York, you get this sort of, well, of course you found me. And it's this kind of just add water, post-Paris Hilton sensibility. And that's sort of fascinating in some way too. I mean, like, I really want to realistically get that down in the painting, in the eyes of the model. In the conversations with a lot of the models that I met, the people that I met in Africa and in India and in Sri Lanka and Brazil and so on, there's this sense of like, are you out of your mind? You know, like, how much money are you going to pay me? Like, and you know, I'm showing them examples of the books, but there's not the same engagement with the mechanisms of fame and the sort of media conversation of how instantaneously one can sort of mind one's own business and walk the streets and then become an instant household name. That is something that should be seen when looking at the works, and something that is embarrassingly modern as, if not postmodern as subject matter, but something that I think informs any contemporary practice of portraiture. You can't talk about this work without talking about the existence of mechanical instruments such as Photoshop. I don't paint from life. I actually use Photoshop to not only take what you think was that actual moment in real life, but to alter the colors, to alter the clothing, to alter certain features, fatten the lips, broaden the eyes, so that you think you're getting this anthropological, reflexive, indexical relationship to actuality, but in fact you're getting this manufactured quasi-truth that sort of approximates a moment, but never quite is there. In fact, for most of the world stage projects, there's often an American in every room. There's often one black boy from the streets of Brooklyn or from Harlem in every single room of these black and brown boys that you see from throughout the world. And so there's a sense of like, am I getting the authentic, this original object? And of course, I'm never going to tell. The lighting and the skin was an extraordinary opportunity going into these sort of deep darks. I had opportunity in the Black American Street, but it was obviously a lot more ample an opportunity in Africa to explore these sort of purples and dark blue blacks that are incredibly hard to paint if you learn how to paint from using classical Western European examples. I started learning how to paint using Rubens and Michelangelo and Leonardo as the example, using the sepia underpainting and allowing the white fleshy highlights to be something that is part of my vocabulary of painting. And so how to construct a proper painting of a beautiful black body resplendent in light is something that isn't part of any sort of actual education process that we have written down or programmatized. So that was Africa, and that was a body of work that I thought was something I really learned from. But I got tired of the heroic. I started wanting to start talking about those moments where failure was at hand. And I was inspired highly by this painting by Holbein, and it was The Fallen Christ. And in this particular picture, there's something about the corporeal reality of it. There's something about this truncated sense of scale. It's almost claustrophobic looking at it, thinking about that tomb. A very genius way of orchestrating a picture. But also, there was something simply about the fact that most of the pictures of Christ that we see are pictures that show a type of radiation, a type of salvation and resplendency, a luminosity and refulgence that we don't see in this particular image. It began a conversation about how we picture our fallen. How does the heroic and how does that sense of survival become imbibed into the body of something that's lifeless? And does that say something about the fallen, or does that say more about those who survived the fallen? And it's a universal question, and I think it's a very particularly African-American question, not only because I am an African-American, but because I know that historically we've woven an entire society around survival and resistance, one that says that while there are certain features that have fallen, we will buttress with others. And so my response to that picture was to create this work, which while carries the pose, certainly, I think is a lot more, I wanted to create something that held this tension between a sort of very pregnant sense of life and that of decay. The flowers in the back are sort of at once in a state of absolute gray decay and pregnant spring. This body of work was, I think, important for me to sort of get out and blast out in terms of scale as well. Christ was not the only fallen figure. We saw military losses as well. And I think that's clearly another great example in the history that allows for us to have a different iteration. The religious as well is something that is clearly another one of those fields. The mythological features in there as well. To go back to the question of scale, though, and the way that scale functions in painting, one has to recognize that the transformation of this object to this object is beautiful in some aspect. We start to see and appreciate the presence of this black body, this brown body in public space, this light drawing itself across the body and shining in a sense of like, I will be here. And people felt really warm and proud about seeing that image. And people felt very included when seeing that image. But I think that at its best, scale introduces a different conversation. And I wanted that painting to exist as painting as blood sport. And there's something to be said about looking at someone who feels and looks just like you on a scale that demands and won't go away quietly. All of these works were, again, about the fallen figure. We're not talking about these perfectly erect moments, but we are talking about moments that can be seen as both sculptural and painting, painted space, for lack of a better word. It starts with photography. It all does. All of that starts with a simple snapshot. From that snap, there has to be certain lighting effects. You don't get that lighting unless you manipulate the lights. I actually have some studio assistants whose job it is to like oil people down and spray them with water. Krista, I see you back there. She's always like, yeah, I'll be next. There's other moments where you try to create a sort of like material, like how do you even get there? You know, I saw this sculpture and it was just absolutely heartbreaking, but how do you get there? In my case, the photographic process required actually taking this poor kid and throwing warm water, mind you, but gallons and gallons of warm water on top of this this sheet, and that's how you arrive at making these works. And I think for any of you who are art students here, process is everything, as you know, and it's so important to, when speaking about your work, not only to talk about what it means to look at the work, but how you got to the work. Because by and large, how you got to it will inform how you look at it. There's something really difficult about taking a piece of marble and making that into form. And we look at this image very differently than we look at a painting, for example, and how you take colored paste and a hairy stick and sort of manipulate that vocabulary. But even process in terms of how you find your models and how you find people. Process and content in my work are inseparable. They're one and the same. I consider my life story to be about sort of proceeding, about putting one foot in front of the other and fashioning a story, a journey around identity, certainly. It's about me as this young black man in American society. It's also about gender. It's about self-portraiture. You know, these are all guys. These are all black guys. These are all, by and large, it began as a very American project. It's about sexuality. I mean, when I'm approaching these guys in the street, there is a sense that, like, this is another dude saying, like, you're beautiful enough to be in a painting. So there's a very homoerotic thing going on there. What is that? Well, it's not an answer. It's a process. And at its best, my work speaks solely to process as a unifying principle. In this particular painting, I was in the favelas of Brazil, Vidigal, and looking again at one of the collections of public sculpture in Rio de Janeiro, and really wanting to sort of concentrate on that conversation around young black and brown kids in underserved communities, this time in Brazil, not knowing much about the local society, but wanting to pose questions and to provoke. It's incredibly tough to get into the favelas with my entire camera crew. I film everything, both video and still, and to sort of create this fanfare. We were lucky enough to have met Wagner, who was one of the young men who modeled for me in this particular painting. Where is it there? The guy with the dreads. He allowed us to use his home in the favela. His grandmother opened up her kitchen and provided food for everyone. And we had this amazing photo shoot that day where it began by roaming through the streets and finding a couple guys. And then there was this sort of whisper campaign going throughout the hills of the favela. There's this crazy American paying $100 an hour for I don't know. And pretty soon people started showing up. And there was a line down the hill. But then people started recognizing the types of models that I was choosing for the work as opposed to not. And there was a type of self-correction going on. Thank you so much. You see the cotton?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. There was a type of self-correction going on there too, where there was like a type all of a sudden. And so, you know, you started seeing like this identical looking group of guys, like, and it's a really fascinating thing. But what you ended up with were, I think, some really provocative images of Brazil and the decorative patterns that came out of the marketplaces throughout Brazil. Paintings that were certainly about a type of majesty that you would see in public spaces, but also about the people of Brazil. Quick word on photography. Much of my work is from photography, and so I created a body of work that was simply photo. All of these works are photo. Again, going back to the religious work of Tiepolo, but also imbibing it with the work of people like Hype Williams from early hip-hop work. So Michael Jackson called me a while ago, and it was, I thought a joke, and so I was like, don't take that call. And someone finally said, like, dude, Michael Jackson's trying to call you. Can he have your number? I was like, hell yeah. And so we began this process of going through art history books back and forth. And I'm incredibly proud to be able to sort of have worked on his last commissioned portrait. And it was, I think, a combination of many paintings, but this was the superstructure that undergirded it. There was a number of sort of out-of-the-field things. I've done projects with the likes of Puma to celebrate the World Cup in South Africa, which was an incredibly fun thing to do. I've also worked in the field of sort of criticizing Orientalist paintings in India and Sri Lanka, sort of flattening down the void between the space of Asia Minor and all of South Asia into this sort of absurdist view of India and Sri Lanka. I guess in the end, Orientalist paintings take us into that territory where we see the world outside of our national borders as being incredibly mysterious, as sort of being something to be consumed as well. I think about the works of Caspar David Friedrich, the great landscape painter, who had a sense of rapture in the work a sense in which land is not seen simply as space, but something to be consumed as well. Further works in India would quote very directly this sense of empire, Napoleonic presence. So it's been, I think, a very interesting roller coaster, not only through the streets of America, but increasingly globally. More recently, I was in Israel doing a show which opened in Los Angeles last week that allowed me to photograph Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews and Palestinians and even the Falasha, the Ethiopian Jews. And the beat goes on. That's it. Thank you.
Have you stay on the stage. I'm going to pull some seats over. I was just thanking Kehinde for that feast. I'd like now to welcome Victor Ekpuk to the stage and ask you both to take kind of center stage once our seats are set up. Victor Ekpuk has produced a remarkable series of paintings and performances that features insipidity, a graphic system of writing from the Cross River region of Nigeria. And a number of his works are in the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. He's also a dear friend of the museum. He received his Bachelor of Fine and Applied Art in 1989 from the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, and has had a number of solo exhibitions, currently Mickey on Broadway, which is at the Hillier Art Place here in D.C. He's also shown at the Longview Gallery, here, Gallery 23 in Amsterdam, Brandeis University in Boston, and elsewhere. His group exhibitions are quite numerous. In 2010, he was part of the Global Africa Project at the Museum of Art and Design in New York. 2009, his Unbounded New Art for a New Century at the Newark Museum. And we're so proud to say at the National Museum of African Art that he was featured in Inscribing Meanings, which is a show that was curated by Christine Mullen-Kramer, who's here this evening. His works were also a part of the Gwangju Triennial, the third triennial in 2008, and the first Johannesburg Biennial in South Africa in 1995. Number of residencies include the University of North Carolina, the 18th Street Art Complex in Santa Monica, the Tammy Manyeli Foundation in Amsterdam, and Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. And both Victor and Kehinde's work, as we kind of have seen and will see, expresses a sort of visual anthropology. And also, their fathers are from Nigeria, both Ibibio, in fact, and I suspect that these are just the first points of connection. So please, welcome to the stage. If you want to have a seat. Victor, are you here? Yeah. Thanks so much. Have his forward. Oh yeah, they're coming.
Okay, so do I. Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's nice to be here, and well, I would like to thank the National Museum for African Art for making this meeting to happen, and kind of always liked your work, and when I got curious about your name to start with, and then I said, well, so okay, maybe his parents just gave him that name because of the African connection. But when I dug deeper, I realized that we are actually from the same ethnic group in Nigeria. And I was pretty jazzed by that. So here we have two Ibibio artists sitting here. Of course, he's the most popular one. And so when this opportunity came up, when Jessica asked me if I would do it, to have a conversation with you, I thought, well, why not? And so, I've been very, when I started studying, looking into more detail about your work, I started to see where, well, I'm not making portraits, but how you excavating cultural artifacts sort of is our interest. And I started out being very interested in writing systems in Nigeria. And by the time I started making my own works, the conversation about literacy in Africa became, started to happen because my work sort of brought out that aspect, and people started to ask about that aspects of culture. And now when you were talking about your works and how you're engaging with all these different cultures, started to bring out different questions. And you actually bringing out the using of black models, making the people that were otherwise invisible, visible, and putting them on wall stage, so to speak. And so that was very interesting. I also have some other questions that I thought I should ask you.
Well, you bring up several very interesting points that I'd like to get to before you get to another question, because I think we could spend the night approaching so much of what you've spoken about. Being from Nigeria, the coincidence and chance of naming, whether it be Gerard or Shaniqua or Tyrone or Kehinde or what have you, what is in a name? And how do we create language that's unique within certain cultures, whether it be naming or do we even know that there's a writing system that existed within West Africa prior to the sort of written Western systems that have been introduced? What is it about the anthropological gaze and about looking at the other and looking at the self as seen through National Geographic and television and so much? So much of what I was brought up as is an African American. I never knew my dad. My dad and my mom separated before I was even born. My father returned back to Nigeria, and I grew up quite happily as a fatherless African American child. It was only until I got older that I got very curious about the nature of my bloodline. And I actually raised some cash, albeit meager at the time. I was a student, and I got onto a plane and I tried to find my father. And it took me a while. It actually took me about a month of going from place to place to place. My father and mother met in California back in the 1970s. He was on scholarship, and they both were studying at university together. And they had, a student love affair, and, no judgment. It didn't work. So I do remember my mother saying it was a quite passionate love affair, and he knew about the pregnancy, but it didn't work out. And she tried to write him these letters like, "You better name these kids." And she was studying African linguistics at the time. Okay. She was specifically interested in the Bantoid language stock that sort of goes from much of northwestern Africa all the way down to south. And we were twins, and so she named us Taiwo and Kehinde.
Yeah.
The Ibeji names were twins, first and second twins. Fast forward, years later, I'm on a plane, I'm going from university to university. Do you know this guy? I figure he studied architecture in the States, maybe in Africa, in Nigeria, the most populated region.
Yeah.
I could find this one man, and and I did. I found him. And it was not through that channel. It was actually through going the ethnic route, and someone said, "Well, what is your father's, Kehinde, what's your father's last name?" Obot. And it's like, well, that's not a Yoruba
That's not
name.
Yoruba name.
Right, right. So they suggested that I go to Akwa Ibom.
Akwa Ibom.
Yeah. I actually jumped through to Calabar, and I went to UNICAL, the University of Calabar, which is in Cross River State, and his name is on the door of the architecture department. Talk about a fucking Oprah moment.
Wow. Yeah. Really Oprah moment.
And of course, I was a young art student, so I'm walking around with my camera, and I'm filming everything, and I've got I'm like totally wired. And this was back in like the cassette days and stuff, so like rolling and stuff.
What year was this?
This was back in, 1997, right? So there was no, like, I couldn't just put it on, like, record on my iPhone or something.
Right, yeah.
Just, like, at any rate, so I meet him, and it was transformative. I won't go into it much, but it really affected the way that I began making paintings that entire year. I haven't shown any of those paintings because they're intensely personal, but I made a number of paintings just of him. Imagine that, not knowing what your own father looks like every single day as a visual thinker. That engagement with Africa was something that I was so longing for, and I poured myself into literature surrounding Nigeria and the Ibibio culture specifically. But we grew up in a house with a mother who studied African linguistics and African culture, and we had friends from her college years where we were all, so the food was very familiar, the language was very familiar, the culture seemed very sort of familiar, but it was also very, very sort of alien at once, this third space, which is, I think, an appropriate way to start talking about the art-making process, isn't it?
Yeah, it would be, because talking about, being a young man growing up, even I lost my father as an adult. Until today, there's still questions that if a son would want to ask a father and he's not there, so
Sure.
I totally understand that.
Sure.
And sort of how you would bring that as an artist, I guess you have ways of bringing that into your work, and we all do. The way that I've seen that some of your portraits that you've made are quite. In a way, looking at it, you've already said it, some of them could be very personal stories. Mm. And sometimes I see that in your work. And when you talking about, sort of meeting your father, and I've seen it in the Africa works, especially, that you've mentioned that, the feel of the portraits, the skin tones are very different. When we talk going back to college days, I also trained as a painter. I used to make portraits. When I had the opportunity of making a portrait of a white person, it used to take me much more color to paint a black person and different tones and things like that. So when I had to paint the portrait of a black person, I realized that of a white person, I realized that I was done within a short time. I was like, is that it?
Interesting.
And because there were instances where you would, my painting lecturer would tell me that where there's so many different colors in the background that you see on the face.
Certainly,
and so
certainly.
There's so many different shades of blues and pinks and so on that comes into that.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of a very interesting angle to that.
Yeah. I would actually, I think in my own experience, I think I got I learned very quickly how to master the look and feel of the sort of fleshy, glowing weight of a Rubens, right? I learned over much time to create that sort of mid-zone between caramel and dark chocolate that might be a sort of African-Americanist state, right? But one of the great things about the world stage has been that I'm constantly destabilized. I've more recently been doing small studies of the Chinese and sort of trying to get that down. And you would think ostensibly that, if you've got this sort of basic yellow tan thing, I hate to sort of use these blunt objects of language to talk about It's such a beautiful range of skin tone. But as a painter, when you get in there, you start realizing those same purples that exist in painting the darkest of the dark can actually, given the certain light, exist in a young kid from Beijing, and it's really kind of fascinating. But the material aspect of painting and I think the social aspect of it are so deeply entwined. There's so much resentment surrounding how do you arrive at like the black body finally? Am I going to do it like with so much more love and so much more sort of softer lines? I remember Kerry James Marshall came to my studio at Yale, and he spoke about this. He said there's a certain empathy to the softening or the hardening of the contour on a figure. Mm-hmm. So it's a choice. Are you going to create an angular or graphic edge on your figures, or are you going to create something that's much more empathetic? And I sort of vacillate between those two fields. I know I sound terribly non-committal right now, but it's at the service, I think, of a project that allows for more fluidity of intent.
Okay, yeah, and I did. You did mention it, but maybe you need to. We would like to expand on that a little bit about one of your paintings where you had sperms swimming in the background.
Right.
I kind of see that as symbolic, but you didn't actually explain.
Right. It was good for like a painting or two, but like it would just be like a cheap one-liner if you just kept up that way. But I think at the time I was thinking about this question of how scale and color and just subject matter are so obviously driven towards a type of chest-beating masculinist bravado. And I was thinking specifically of paintings in the 50s and 60s. I was thinking a lot about Motherwell, and I was thinking a lot about Jackson Pollock, actually, and specifically, because Pollock, if you think about it, becomes this crazy moment where the drip is the object, right? And you create this sort of perverse notion of the drip as the money shot, just really this oversized thing. But then you also have that sense in which you go to the Louvre and you see these Davids that are sort of marching forward in the sense of domination. And so if you distill these down to the most essential components, it's both about the sperm cell, but remember that these sperm cells are painted in gold leaf, right? And so it's about these paintings, including my own, which are, remember, high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers. Mm-hmm. It's sort of blinged out hyper-masculinity on steroids.
Yeah, and probably hypersexuality as well.
That comes later, but yeah, I don't think that like the depiction of like little spermatozoa is particularly like sexual, but I think that the way that light draws itself across the body is incredibly erotic. I think that if you look at chiaroscuro painting in its history, you'll notice that this is, I think, at the heart of Rembrandt. It's something that is about presence, but it's also about rapture. How slowly does the light reveal itself across the flesh? And it's so much about the body. It's about corpulence. It's about the physical. Sperm is much more symbolic. It's more of an ideation, whereas the light is actual. It's lived. It's visceral. That's sexy.
Yeah. On the issue of because the issue of perceptions of your work, for people who have not sat here or anywhere else to listen to you talk about your work in depth or see the depth of thought that goes into your work, and all they see is that larger than life portraits in museums, and the perception of the stereotyping of the black male and stuff like that. And then they see this painting and then they see sperm and then they see these these models that are standing up there and staring down smugly at the audience.
Right.
And for some people, it could be they could see some kind of arrogance. They could see some kind of you daring to put it to their faces.
Well, no,
and put them in that space.
I mean, you were there. You saw those original paintings, right? I mean,
right.
The art history is so full of itself, you know. And sure, I'm like working in that blast zone, and people might get confused and think, it's about me. No, I mean, these guys were up to some stuff, And it's really fascinating to work within that field of power. And to be able to use that field of power as yet another color on the palette, as a way of sort of dealing with powerlessness, and a way of dealing with absence, and a way of dealing with also these transformations within fields of power. And I'm thinking specifically right now within a very nationalist set of inquiry. And I think so many of my friends as artists now are starting to work in studios globally. I personally have a studio in Dakar, Senegal, Beijing, and New York. I have friends who work all over the place and work in collaboration with different artists. And this question surrounding whose dominant narrative rules the day is one that I think is particularly salient right now. I think by and large, many American artists took their Americanness for granted. It was almost as though we existed in the center, and then the periphery sort of had to bend to us. And now as artists, and increasingly as viewers and as art consumers, as we see the world consuming art as well, not only well-heeled Western Europeans and New Yorkers, it becomes something that says sort of, how does your state in the world and your place in the world matter, insofar as that earlier history, which had to do with your sort of maleness and that center of power. We all are dealing within these sort of these peripheries and cores, and sort of negotiating our place within all of that.
Yeah, and the world, the art world is, as I've seen, it's continually expanding, and incorporating a lot of other narratives and cultures and so on in their works, and then sort of now more and more accepting of others' stories and viewpoints. And it's sort of beginning to show that there's more to what some people already knew than they do. And going back to that, your American paintings were that experience, but then you started traveling around the world, and how has that sort of change your viewpoints from before you traveled out,
right,
and now that you're doing this global work? How does that change your viewpoints about not just your work, but just life itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, before I didn't know anything, but I had an assumed level of access because I was a Black American, and so people just assumed, well, he's a Black American, so he can sort of speak without contest about a very, very Black American experience. Whereas in my experience, there's just been so many different types of Black America that it's just like I'm meeting sort of newness every time. And so I felt personally destabilized every time I would come to a new community, growing up in South Central Los Angeles and going to Harlem was a huge leap, and sort of negotiating that sort of difference in culture, and then going to Columbus, Ohio, and so on. And now, of course, we're talking about much more than these small moves within your own community, but rather these larger global conversations. At its best, these sets of moves are destabilizing me as a thinker, as a painter, as a person. When it comes down to it, this is my life we're talking about. These are years and years. Why are you doing all of this? Number one, I enjoy being in the world. I enjoy sort of co-evolving with this experience that I've wrapped myself in. But I think I am sort of scratching at certain itches, certain desires to picture myself, and in so saying, that is incredibly narcissistic enterprise, the idea that one would look into the world as a looking glass. And I think it's also an incredibly American enterprise, the idea that one would sort of see identity as something that has to be found. This idea, I'm going to go outside and find myself. And my mother's like, well, if you ever find yourself, Jesus, what are you going to do then? You know? Yeah. And so it's you know, I think there is something very American about the desire to participate in what has historically been a touristic gaze. You know, the idea that we're going to pick up and go look at the other, consume, and then pack up and go home. The other model would be the anthropological gaze, where we are now recording and teaching.
Okay.
There's the religious missionary gaze, which is something slightly different. And there's a few others which have to do with the mechanisms of control and domination, and how do you physically take over people and get their shit. But I think I'm more interested in this question around how do you walk into a country that you have no real knowing or knowledge of, and you've got a lot of Travel Channel and National Geographic and travel narratives and Margaret Mead and all of this in your mind. How do you authentically, if there is something called authenticity anymore in art, authentically engage in a process of picturing another and negotiating a system of power dynamics? And so it's a very sort of self-conscious act of juggling and puppetry, and I don't know what that is. You know, I don't know how to give you a firm mission statement. I always come back to this word proceed. I simply proceed.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed, you know, watching your process. And it's just like you pointed out, the figures in the American paintings, as you know, the models, American models had more attitude of, you know, self-absorbed kind of attitudes. And then the other models in other countries were a little bit, I mean, they still look noble and self-assured, but then there wasn't so much of
right.
hype about them.
I almost feel guilty looking at those paintings sometimes. You know, I mean, I almost feel guilty looking at what I've created, because what you've created is this frightened kid who's like, is this what you want? Yeah. And I think that's kind of, I know it's kind of perverse, but I think that's sort of an interesting picture to look at. You know, like you're creating these situations, these provocations, these moments in times, and they're ruptures. They're the answers to questions that no one thought to pose. Does painting do more than point? Are these paintings designed to transform anyone's life or to redeem in any sort of social way? I'm quite sure that they do. If you look at the museum numbers of attendance at any one of my exhibitions, the communities surrounding these museums, start to see underserved communities populating those museums on scales that you wouldn't imagine. Is that my starting point? No, it's purely selfish. I mean, it's just that is what it is. But am I a human being who cares about that blast zone, and who actually stands on the shoulder of so many other artists of color who gave me a sense of, yeah, I can be part of that. Yes, yeah. I think that's in there too.
Yeah, I think it should really be a plus, because you know, doing what you do, being able to, your work is able to resonate with people from your background who see your work, mostly not you, but your work as a sort of something to aspire to, even just the idea of the image of being larger than life. And the words that came to my mind when I was thinking about this is that Kehinde Wiley is a dream maker, and then that you're a dream maker, and that you're also creating wet dreams.
You're dirty.
You can take that anywhere you want, but
Well, I was going to say this might be a good time for audience questions. We can ask you to stand as you ask your question. Thank you, and you can field them.
Actually, let me go ahead and take that one. Because there is something called a lucid dream, and for those of you who follow any of Freud's interpretations of dreams, or the structuring of dreams, whether it be through classic psychoanalysis or any of the more scientific notions of like REM sleep or what have you, dreams are a space in which the body replenishes themselves, but also it's contested, but the mind goes into states of both processing the lived and waking life, but also goes through certain practical simulations of how to proceed the following day and how to learn from what has happened before. Lucid dreams are when, in that state of dreaming, you actually know that you're dreaming. One has a sense in which, and I'm sure we all have that moment from time to time, in which you have this uncanny sense in which I know I'm dreaming. I actually take it to a point where I actually start to proceed and do things within my dreams, knowing that I'm dreaming. I look forward to it because that's your own little kingdom. There's a lot of things you can do in there. But there's, within many traditional societies, shamanistic traditions, certainly within the Ibibio tradition and all throughout West Africa, the dream space is a space in which what we call the artist in Western society starts from, and most societies gather around someone who uses that dream space as a unifying object and not something that's simply an egocentric notion of this is my story, but actually I'm going to use my dream space to sort of help engage questions of the individual and the larger group. So what might seem as a very sort of flip, superfluous question actually has, I think, broader ramifications in terms of the way that we think about the mind and the creative process. Let's take some questions. Sure. This project is a project, and I do work from project to project. I think it's important for me to make it sort of airtight, no oxygen in the room, all boys, all the time, no exceptions, no matter how many questions I'm asked. And that is this project. Am I preparing something else? I'm not going to tell you that. That would fuck up the surprise. Sure. We know, I think, by and large, that abstraction is the descendant of a long line of changes within art's evolution. And it became in terms of popular parlance, we have to look at the decay of representational space. Cubism, I think, was a very good break with the landscape or with the figure. And we start with that one move to start noticing that we're getting closer and closer to getting away from stuff that looks like stuff. And so eventually you're arriving at painting that's not even about abstraction or decoration, but painting about paint itself. It's a very almost nihilistic impulse, the desire to sort of move away from what one's original presence was, the sort of slaying of the father. It's a very Oedipal way of looking at existing in the world. But it also goes to the heart of, I think, the Western imagination, the idea that authenticity and originality is something that must proceed. And how do you arrive at originality? Well, you have to start by naming the father, which is portrait, landscape, still life. What's the next step? You fracture that. What's the next step? You fracture that. Well, that's a zero-sum game. Where do we arrive at the end? And I think that that has been, by and large, the crisis of contemporary painting. And my project has been about how do we make painting exist in the 21st century in a way that actually goes back to some of the bones of its original starting point, its original rallying point, but provides perhaps a different context, a different rubric through which to read those points. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes I'm just like...
You're the professor.
Sure.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating. I have a question related to the reception of your work, and it's kind of a multiple layered one. First is I want to know what your father thinks about your work, and then secondly, even just the general, in terms of who the audience is for this work and how your work is being received. Clearly, quite on an international level, it's had a very popular resonance, and sort of how you see that reception of your work.
Right.
First on a personal level.
Right. Let's talk about my dad. My dad doesn't care. And my mom, in some ways, has that same attitude. It's like, I got a lot of kids, and you're doing your thing. That's cool. I think it's important to look at most families as being like lovers almost. You're so closely bound, and when things happen that are big for the community outside, that's, well, good for you, but we were with this guy all along, and so it's a very sort of intimate relationship with the work, and so we have very different conversations about it as well. I remember being in Los Angeles just 3 days ago, and I'm constantly photographing my mother and my brothers, my sisters, with this idea of sort of working this out in art somehow. And during the entire process, we have these incredibly nuanced conversations about art history and about the ways to look at art and painting and pop culture, and it's I think it's incredibly helpful for me. They're like good shrinks because they just know me to the bone. But I think it's also something that lies outside of what my work has become. Within the last 10 years, my work has become something that was fairly popular to sort of this type of phenomenal thing that it is at once interesting to them, but sort of a it's just like whatever, which is really healthy and like kind of great to come home to.
Sort of like a prophet has no respect in his own his own town because they know you.
Right.
Right.
That's right. All right. Right here.
Yes, my question is, 10 years ago, where did you see yourself? Did you see yourself as being this kind of global phenomenon, or did it kind of just happen out of nowhere?
Well, it didn't happen out of nowhere. For those of you who might be interested in studying art or pursuing art here, I actually graduated from Yale in 2000 and applied immediately for the artist in residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And it's an extraordinary institution with an immense history of supporting artists and work of African-American artists in New York. And they only accept 3 people every year as their artists in residence. I left Yale with no pretensions of having any sort of career. I actually applied to the program and then returned immediately back to live in my mom's basement. And I got the phone call that allowed for me to have the free time in New York to just simply be. those years after graduate school where I was able to make paintings outside of professors' criticism, right? That sort of dynamic of student to student, who's the cool kid on campus sort of thing, that just like gets into your mind as well. And then also to have the freedom to not work at all if you don't like, and just kind of like stop and look.
Yeah.
And what I did do was to stop and look at Harlem, and and that's where I started the lecture. Noticing the mugshots and the portraiture and all of this stuff that was pre-Yale. This was like back when I was studying early painting back in LA as a kid, and so I think that to answer your question, I had no illusions about getting anywhere. I really simply wanted to survive, and I knew it was going to be a tough route. I studied cooking as a day job, or night job rather, thinking that I would, cook by night and then, paint a little bit and support my art habit. And I think that it comes down to just really being able to run into that flame and know that there's always going to be some measure of support there. And perhaps it's just a level of radical recklessness on my part. I just simply didn't care. I wanted to make these paintings. And I still, to this day, with all of the opportunity and creature comforts and all of this, it's just like one of those things where you just, you wake up every day and you start thinking about how you can, there's something really enjoyable about looking at someone and getting that down, or increasingly taking an experience and getting that down. But yeah, there's no, I had no idea.
If I may add to that, yes, he graduated from Yale and did all that, but it takes hard work. It takes a dedication to your craft. Because I'm sure hundreds of other people have gone through Studio Museum or other residencies, but you don't hear about them. So I think from what I see in your work, you paint like you're on steroids, more like. and to be able to produce this large canvases takes a lot of commitment right from the start, and so that you don't get bored at the end of before you finish it. And I think it takes that kind of dedication for an artist or somebody who aspires to be an artist, and then a bit of recklessness that says, well, who cares? I just want to do it. And then when you build it, they say they will come. But if they come and there's nothing for them to see, then what do you do with that?
Good question. I think another thing that comes out of what you're saying too is, as I began making bigger and bigger stuff, I needed more and more help. I'm not doing all those flowers, you're right.
Thank you for the honesty.
Right, no, seriously. And so there's just like a material reality to it as well, so what begets, and it sort of becomes almost like a type of orchestration. Now I refuse to, for some reason I have this sort of romantic attachment to painting all of the portraits, and that's what I do. But in the 21st century, with friends like, well, I won't mention any specific names, but there's a number of people who sort of really believe in sheer conceptual painting, where you design everything on the computer and then your assistants go off and they create things, and you're the thinker behind it, which is valid in its own right. I think what my work exists, where my work exists, is this middle place where I'm in there sort of doing all of those. We as people love looking at landscapes and love looking at bowls of fruit, but when we see a portrait, we're fixed, and so that's where I shine. That's where I move. But increasingly, for example, when you saw that large picture of the guy, so every mile of that flesh I'm in there with my little brushes, and it takes me months and weeks and so on, and your back is almost out and so on. But there's something about it. It's almost, it's like you wake up every day and that rock is right down there at the foot of the hill, like Sisyphus, you know. An extraordinary feeling.
Yeah, if I may just, how do you handle the I'm sure by now your work is pretty much, it's a lot in demand, and how do you handle that, being that you do this, most of it manually? How do you handle to feel the demand that collectors want?
Just wait in line. You can't, yeah, I mean, and that's just, that's economics. You supply and demand. Listen, the slower it takes to make a painting, the more valuable they are. So, I always start off with this conversation around, let's not forget what this is. These are high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers. And what does that mean when we start looking at these black bodies from poor countries, right? There's some really interesting stuff going on in here that rarely gets spoken about. I think many people want to talk more about the sort of beautiful, redemptive entertainment aspect of the work, but I think the class dynamics that are bound within this work are real as well. As an artist, what is my social responsibility? Should I stop because the art industrial complex exists in the way that it does? Should a filmmaker stop because it requires so much to sort of produce this enterprise? Should Obama run again because it takes 1 billion to get to this place, right? All of these things are, the material realities of this are not only tied up in the act of making my specific type of painting, but they're also tied up in the entire narrative of art as a fetish within the American and increasingly global imagination.
Yeah, talking about, you just mentioned the art industrial establishment. I remember some times ago we were just sort of chatting on Facebook and the word game came into the chat. Since you're now part of the establishment or beneficiary, huge beneficiary of the establishment, so how do you, are we talking about art as business now?
Yeah.
Because from what you just said, you seem to take that premise that art, the product, that they are eventually become products. How do you situate yourself in that? And there's some people who have this romantic idea of art that it should be pure, have purity from commerce and stuff like that.
Art never did. Art never did. I think art, much like words, are evidence of something in the world that we want to communicate, not to ourselves. Words are things that are designed to commune. Communication is what we're doing. We're exchanging ideas. Even if there's not a monetary exchange, there is a type of exchange between ideas that occurs when you create one utterance on a cave wall, or whether you start to begin creating commissioned portraits of the church or the state, or even in today's modern art world. This innocence that art can never be divorced from the material realities is something that even street artists have to come to terms with. There's an extraordinary show that is opening at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles now of the evolution of street art in this country, and specifically in its more modern incarnations. And what we're exchanging there is a type of credibility, a street credibility, and there's an exchange. There's a consumer confidence within that field as well. Yeah. There's a consensus within that field, and all of these can eventually begin to resemble some of the more heady aspects of higher economic theory, when we start to begin to think that perhaps paper money is really based upon a set of social standards and about social agreements, and around how the notions that we have a consensus around power and fields. And it has much less to do with an actual physical object, but rather it's more about people, isn't it?
Right.
And it's about the signs that we create. And so I'm not really trading in objects, I'm really trading in language in many ways. I'm trading in a specific type of music, a type of vibration of sound, chords that are coming together that we all sort of weave and applaud to at a certain point.
And getting handsomely paid for it.
Well, it depends on how you consider handsome, you know? I mean, like, no, seriously. I mean, like, I'm handing out like $100 an hour to poor kids in the streets of where have you, India or Sri Lanka or what have you. And the question there is like, is that enough? Or even if you start shooting higher, will that sort of decay the systems just to the point where it becomes like perverse and it just becomes a bloodletting and economic relativity? Where do these paintings go? Do they go into the museums or do they go into auction houses? And who are these people who are buying these things? Where do these paintings go? There's these black bodies hanging on the walls of whose homes? You know, by and large, the people who own these paintings don't look like me. Guess who's coming to dinner? You know, the painting's right over the dinner table. And so it is, I hate to bring up that relative question, but it is a very relative question, which is absolutely fascinating in many ways, but also deeply troubling on many parts. But I can't stop because of the complexity. I think I must proceed in more interesting and quite possibly more perverse ways.
Well, thank you for bringing black bodies into, allowing people to openly accept black bodies. Well, where they used to be covertly accepted before.
Cool.
Thank you, Victor Ekpuk and Kehinde Wiley, and to all of you. Good night. Thank you.
That's good.
Good job, guys.